Tom Bauer, welcome to The Breakfast Show. This week, a huge week for you, my friend. 26, the book's out. Betrayal, Power, Deceit and the Fight for the Future of the Royal Family. And the reason there's so much talk about this book is this claim of yours, this astonishing statement said to be made by Queen Camilla to a friend, this is in the book, that Camilla said, and I quote about Harry and Meghan, she's been brainwashing him. They have kicked back already, Tom, ahead of publication. Harry and Meghan saying that this is deranged conspiracy, my friend. How do you answer that?
Well, I'm firstly grateful to them because they pushed the book up to #1 on Amazon. And secondly, I'm not surprised. I mean, for them, any criticism is always poisonous and damaging, and particularly from me. But I can assure you it's very well sourced from the person who heard it from the Queen's mouth. And it's true. I mean, that's the point. It is actually, unfortunately, true.
For months, one version of the story appeared settled. Then Tom Bauer focuses on a single date buried inside the timeline. And suddenly, the entire sequence looks different. Because if that date is wrong, the problem is no longer a forgotten detail. It becomes a question of what happened around it. What makes the challenge so unsettling is its precision. Bauer is not arguing over tone, emotion, or the kind of memory that can blur with time. He is pointing toward a date that appears to hold the story together. Move that date, even slightly, and other events begin to shift with it. Meetings no longer fall where people assumed. Requests for access take on a different meaning. Decisions that seemed like reactions may suddenly look as though they were already in motion. Inside royal life, chronology carries weight. A private conversation may leave no public record, but travel, security, invitations, staff movements, official engagements, and access to senior royals often create a trail. That does not reveal every word spoken behind closed doors, but it can narrow what was possible and when. And that is why a date can become more dangerous than an accusation. An opinion can be disputed. A sequence can be tested. For a long time, the accepted version had hardened through repetition. Interviews, commentary, retellings, and public debate gave it the shape of something familiar. Then, Bauer returns, not with a louder charge, but with a quieter problem: the chronology may not fit. For Meghan, the stakes are high. If the timing changes, the motives assigned to others may change as well. A decision portrayed as punishment could appear to have been discussed before the supposed trigger. A confrontation believed to have caused a response might instead have happened after the response had already begun. That leaves one question hanging over everything. Was this simply an innocent mistake, a difference in recollection, or proof that two versions of the same episode cannot both occupy the same timeline? And inside palace circles, where dates, access, and protocol are watched closely, some may have understood that danger long before the public did. And once that single date is placed back into the royal calendar, another detail begins to move with it, one involving exactly who knew what and when. The contradiction only becomes powerful when the surrounding days are reconstructed. Invitations, movements, private discussions, and royal schedules begin falling into place like pieces of a locked puzzle, and the closer the dates are examined, the harder it becomes to preserve the original sequence without creating another unanswered question. The disputed date is only the center point. The real pressure begins when everything around it is placed back in order. What happened several days before? Which royal engagements had already been confirmed? Who was traveling? Who was meeting advisors? And which private discussions were supposedly taking place while the public still believed nothing had changed? That is where the chronology starts to tighten. A major royal decision is rarely made in isolation. Senior figures move through schedules shaped by private secretaries, security teams, household staff, transport plans, formal engagements and conversations that often begin long before the public hears anything. Those layers do not reveal every private word, but they create boundaries. A person cannot easily be in two places at once. A meeting cannot influence a decision if the decision appears to have been underway beforehand. And that is the possibility now hanging over the story. If the disputed date shifts, an event previously described as the trigger for palace action may no longer be the trigger at all. A confrontation that supposedly caused concern could instead appear after advisors were already discussing what to do. A request that seemed to provoke resistance may have arrived when the resistance was already forming. That distinction changes everything. Bauer does not need to reconstruct every sentence spoken behind closed doors. His challenge becomes stronger if he can simply show that the accepted sequence has a structural weakness. Public memory is built through interviews and repetition. Institutional chronology is built through appointments, movements, diaries, and official commitments. Memories can compress several tense days into one emotional moment. Calendars are much harder to compress, and buried among those fixed points may be one overlooked engagement that matters more than anyone first realized. Its significance is not dramatic on its own, but if it places a particular royal in contact with advisors before the supposed crisis began, then the timeline starts pointing toward an entirely different beginning. But the timeline creates an even more uncomfortable problem. Because the disputed date does not merely affect Meghan's version, it appears to place another senior royal inside the story earlier than anyone expected. Then, the timeline produces its first real shock. A senior royal appears in the sequence before the moment that was supposedly meant to trigger their involvement. If the reconstructed chronology is correct, palace concern may not have been a sudden reaction at all. It may already have been quietly building. That changes the emotional center of the story. Until now, the conflict could be understood as a reaction. Something happens. Tensions rise, senior figures become involved, and the palace responds. But if one royal was already being briefed before the supposed breaking point, then the crisis may have started somewhere else entirely. According to this reconstructed sequence, conversations may already have been moving quietly through the royal household, not dramatic confrontations, not explosive meetings, something subtler. Advisors speaking to private secretaries, concerns being passed upward. Questions about protocol, precedent, and what might happen next. That is how institutions protect themselves. They rarely wait for a public explosion before thinking about consequences. For Meghan, that possibility would carry a painful implication. She may have believed a later incident caused the resistance she encountered. But if senior figures were already discussing the situation, then what felt like punishment after one confrontation may actually have grown from concerns that existed beforehand. And that creates two competing realities. From one side, the response can look cold, personal, even hostile. Doors appear to close. Messages become more controlled. Decisions feel predetermined. From the palace side, the same actions may be seen as caution, an attempt to protect hierarchy, precedent, and the monarch from a dispute becoming larger. This is where Bauer's challenge becomes more serious than simply saying a date was wrong. The deeper suggestion is that the wrong date may have hidden the true beginning of the conflict. If the palace was already moving, then the public story may have begun several steps too late. And once that possibility is accepted, another question immediately follows. If senior royals were being briefed earlier, were they also deciding who should be allowed direct contact, who should wait, and which conversations had become too sensitive to happen without intermediaries? And that is where the mystery stops being about calendars and becomes a struggle over something far more valuable inside royal life: private access to the crown. Inside the monarchy, access is power. A private meeting, an unanswered request, even 10 unrecorded minutes with the sovereign can change relationships. And once the disputed date is examined through that lens, Bower's challenge seems to expose a second conflict: who was allowed through the door and who was not. The timing now matters for a different reason. If a request for direct contact came before the disputed incident, then it may have been part of a wider struggle already underway. If it came afterward, it could be seen as an attempt to repair damage. The same request carries a completely different meaning depending on where it sits in the sequence. Inside royal life, private meetings are never entirely private in consequence. Being granted time with the sovereign can signal trust, influence, reconciliation, or simply the right to be heard without layers of advisors standing between two people. That is precisely why palace officials may become cautious when emotions are already running high. A conversation can create expectations. A sympathetic phrase can be interpreted as a promise. A suggestion can later become, in someone's memory, an agreement. For courtiers, that uncertainty is dangerous. From Meghan's perspective in this dramatized account, direct contact may have seemed like the simplest solution. Why rely on intermediaries when misunderstandings were already multiplying? Why allow private secretaries or family members to soften, delay, or reshape a message that could be delivered personally? But the institution sees access differently. Controlled access protects hierarchy. It prevents emotionally charged disputes from reaching the monarch without preparation. It gives advisors time to understand what is being requested and what consequences might follow if a private assurance is later treated as a formal commitment. And somewhere inside this disputed chronology sits an alleged attempt at contact whose timing becomes crucial. Was the door already closing before the confrontation everyone focused on? Or did the request come only after the relationship had deteriorated? That question appears to have become serious enough that another member of the family may have felt compelled to intervene, turning a private communication issue into a struggle over royal authority itself. At that point, the conflict is no longer simply Meghan against Bower's version of events. It becomes a battle over who controlled access, who had the power to say no, and whose understanding of that decision would shape everything that followed. Yet access was only one layer. Because behind those doors sat an older royal rule, one Meghan may have encountered without ever being formally told it existed. The monarchy survives through rules written in documents and rules written nowhere at all. Bower's disputed date now collides with one of those invisible boundaries, revealing why a seemingly personal disagreement may have alarmed courtiers far beyond the people directly involved. The issue was not merely what happened. It was precedent. Inside royal life, some expectations are never formally explained because insiders assume everyone already understands them. Hierarchy matters. Timing matters. Who speaks first matters. Who asks for a private meeting? Who carries the message? And who is expected to accept a decision without turning it into a wider confrontation can carry enormous significance. For someone entering that world from outside, those customs can look flexible. A decision may seem open to discussion. A delayed answer may feel like an invitation to keep asking. Persistence can look like clarity, determination, even self-protection. But inside the palace, the same behavior can be read very differently. Courtiers may see repeated pressure as a challenge to order itself. If one person can bypass an established process because the issue feels personal enough, others may expect the same. That is where individual emotion collides with institutional survival. And the disputed date makes that collision more dangerous. If Meghan was responding after a palace decision had already been settled, then her actions can be understood as resistance to something already determined. But if the chronology moves backward, she may instead have been trying to influence an outcome she believed was still undecided. That difference is enormous. It also places Harry in a far more uncomfortable position. He understood the family from the inside. He knew which rules were spoken openly and which were simply obeyed. Yet he was also trying to defend his wife inside a system she may have interpreted very differently. Bower's reconstructed sequence now raises the possibility that Harry knew institutional resistance existed before Meghan believed the dispute had truly begun. If so, he was no longer simply standing beside her in a conflict. He may have been carrying information between two worlds that no longer trusted each other, and that creates the most personal question yet. If Harry already understood that the palace objected, what exactly did he tell Meghan? Did he describe the decision as final? Did he suggest there was still room to negotiate? Or did he delay the full truth because he feared what would happen once both sides realized how far apart they already were? That question turns the spotlight away from Bower and Meghan for the first time, because the next fracture in the timeline runs directly through Harry himself. If the dates are correct, Harry may have been standing between two realities at once. What the palace believed had already been decided, and what Meghan believed was still open for discussion. Suddenly, the most painful question is not who was right. It is whether Harry understood the gap before anyone else did. That possibility makes Harry the emotional hinge of the entire dispute. He was not simply another royal caught in the fallout. He may have been the person carrying information between two sides that were already beginning to interpret the same events in completely different ways. From inside the palace, he could have been hearing that a decision was settled, that advisors had concerns, and that certain boundaries would not move. At home, he may have been trying to protect Meghan from a system he believed was rigid, suspicious, or unwilling to listen. That placed him under extraordinary pressure. Tell Meghan too early, and the conflict could erupt before he had any chance to soften the outcome. Wait too long, and silence might later look like concealment. Even small differences in language could change everything. They are considering it offers hope. They have decided closes the door. We will discuss it leaves space for another attempt. In a tense royal dispute, those phrases are not interchangeable. They can create entirely different expectations. And that may explain why the beginning of the conflict appears different depending on who tells the story. Perhaps Harry believed an issue could still be reopened after palace officials thought it was finished. Perhaps Meghan understood his optimism as evidence that no final decision had been made. Meanwhile, those inside the institution may have seen further requests as attempts to overturn something already settled. Loyalty then becomes almost impossible to separate. Loyalty to his wife, loyalty to his father, loyalty to the crown, loyalty to his own memory of what was said. That is why Bower's date challenge becomes so explosive. Correcting one point in the chronology may force a reassessment of Harry's role, not as the cause of the dispute, but as the messenger standing between two incompatible versions of reality. And another clue now waits outside those private conversations, where emotion carries less authority. And just when the dispute seems entirely personal, the timeline reaches something far more tangible. An object, privilege, or royal entitlement whose ownership could never be decided by emotion alone. Every royal argument eventually reaches the same cold boundary: what belongs to the person and what belongs to the crown. Behind the disputed date sits a question of privilege, access, property, jewelry, status, or inheritance, and unlike memory, those things are controlled by rules powerful enough to outlast any family feud. This is where the conflict becomes more than emotional. Royal residences, security arrangements, ceremonial roles, patronages, invitations, and jewelry may feel personal to the people using them, but they often exist within systems of permission, ownership, and hierarchy. What appears to be a gift can carry conditions. What feels like an entitlement may still depend on approval, and somewhere inside this reconstructed dispute sits a privilege that seems to carry more weight than its practical value. Perhaps it is access to a residence, perhaps a ceremonial role, perhaps a piece of jewelry whose importance comes not from its price, but from what it represents. Inside royal life, objects can become declarations. A necklace, tiara, brooch, room, title, or invitation can quietly say, "You belong here. You are trusted. You remain inside the circle." That is why losing access can cut deeper than losing possession. The disputed date now becomes crucial again. If an assurance came before palace objections hardened, Meghan may have believed a promise had already been made. But if the timeline shows that no formal approval existed, courtiers could have viewed the same conversation as provisional, something discussed, not guaranteed. That gap between personal understanding and institutional permission is explosive. A royal may hear reassurance and believe the matter is settled. An advisor may hear the same words and think the issue remains subject to protocol. Both sides can leave the conversation believing something completely different. And once status becomes involved, every later decision feels heavier. A withdrawn privilege can feel like rejection. A restricted invitation can feel like demotion. A forbidden jewel can become a symbol of exclusion far beyond the object itself. This is where Bauer's challenge begins to sharpen. The date mismatch may only be the opening. If records exist showing when permission was discussed, requested, delayed, or refused, then the entire argument moves away from interpretation and toward documentation. Because once the emotional symbolism is stripped away, Bauer's argument reaches its most dangerous stage, the point where memory collides with records that do not easily move. Now comes the moment the entire story has been building toward. Bauer places the disputed account beside the reconstructed record, and one gap refuses to disappear. The dates will not sit comfortably together. One version requires an event to happen after consequences that, according to the timeline, may already have begun. That is the contradiction at the center of everything. A decision is said to follow a confrontation. A reaction is said to come after a meeting. A fallout is described as the result of a particular moment. But once the dates are rearranged, the order starts to break apart. If the institutional response began earlier, then the confrontation may not have caused it. If discussions were already taking place, then what looked like sudden punishment may have been part of a process already underway. Cause and effect begin switching places. That does not automatically explain why the stories differ. Memory is complicated. Several tense days can blur together. Conversations can be remembered by emotion rather than sequence. One person may compress separate events into a single turning point, while another remembers them as distinct stages. There is also a harder possibility. A complicated story can become simplified over time because simplicity is easier to explain, easier to defend, and easier for the public to remember. That is where Bauer gains leverage. He does not need to prove what everyone privately intended. He does not need access to every conversation. If the chronology itself creates a contradiction, the unanswered question remains standing on its own. And gradually, attention shifts away from who felt betrayed and towards something colder. Which event actually happened first? The palace staying silent only deepens the tension. Silence proves nothing, but it creates space for competing narratives to harden around the same missing answers. For Meghan, the stakes now reach their highest point. Correcting one date might sound minor, But if that correction changes which decision came first, which meeting mattered, and who already knew what, then accepting the new chronology could force the entire episode to be understood differently. Yet the final twist is not whether one date was wrong, it is what happens to every accusation, every defense, and every royal relationship once that date is moved into its new position. A calendar entry should not be powerful enough to reopen a royal war, but this one does. By the end, the contradiction has spread far beyond Bower and Meghan, touching Harry, palace advisors, private promises, royal privilege, and the uncomfortable possibility that everyone remembers the same crisis from a different starting point. Once the revised chronology is accepted, every earlier piece changes position. The private request no longer means quite the same thing. The palace response appears less sudden. Harry's role becomes harder to define. Even the question of privilege shifts, because what once looked like a withdrawal may instead look like something that was never fully approved in the first place. That is where the conflict becomes almost impossible to settle. The deepest divide is no longer about one argument. It is about when trust actually started to collapse. From Meghan's perspective in this dramatized account, the pain could become even sharper if she genuinely believed events happened in another order. Discovering that institutional records point elsewhere would not necessarily erase her experience. It might deepen the sense that two completely different realities were operating at the same time. For Bower, the date has now become more than a challenge. It is a catalyst. By questioning one fixed point, he creates pressure around everything connected to it. Who knew? Who decided? Who promised? Who waited? And who believed the matter was still open? Harry remains caught in the middle. Was he protecting Meghan from a decision he knew would hurt her? Did he believe the palace might still bend? Or did he become the messenger later blamed by both sides because neither accepted the other's version? The monarchy makes that uncertainty even more powerful. It is an institution built around precedent, rank, inheritance, records, and continuity. People may disagree about feelings for years, but dates, access, appointments, and permissions leave behind a structure. That is why royal disputes become so explosive. Private emotion exists inside a system that remembers almost everything while explaining very little. And if one small date can force this many questions back open, then the final mystery becomes unavoidable. How many other accepted royal stories would change if the complete private timeline were ever revealed? Because in royal history, the most dangerous secrets are not always hidden inside locked vaults. Sometimes they are sitting openly on a calendar, waiting for someone to notice that the dates no longer match.